Welcome to the breakdown of my level, Evil. Let's start at the beginning. The breakable blocks on the left are purposefully exposed to show the player that with a mushroom they could go through there. The reason for the blocks under the mush not being breakable is the same, to draw attention to the rest being breakable. The reason there are two rows of blocks on the left is because of the fish block and the sound effects in the top row, which I don't yet want to reveal to the player as they are playing from the beginning of the level. The contraption that blows the wall up is very simple. This thwomp acts as a simple Y position detector, flips the switch and blows up all three of these bombs, dropping the player if they didn't jump up, allowing the mushroom to go through and letting the player through respectively. The intent here was to make the player think about getting the mushroom from the top or from the bottom, like what the solution in a few places in levels from recent history was, and not think about whether or not they should get the mushroom at all. Most people just jumped up without thinking and got the mushroom without thinking, so it turned out to work out more as one of those basic haha, you got a power up, you shouldn't have trolls instead, but that's fine because of the next troll. The don't get the mush is boring, but I think an immediate repetition of the same thing with the same mush makes it work. The reason for the bomb here is to make the player think they need the mush to break through the block and use the bomb to go through on the right. In a sense, is to keep the player from thinking that the room is a trap. Obviously, the block has a big spike ball that does many things. It kills the bomb to keep the player from using it to cheese, it breaks the wall, and then it rolls onto the slope and opens the way for the mush. The reason this mush is on top of this one is twofold. The first is anti-cheese, so the player couldn't take damage, get the mush and then go through. The second is for speed, as the first fate to give it to the player was dropping from a track on the bomb track here, however that was way too slow. With this setup, what you see is what you get. The spike ball cannot spawn if the player doesn't destroy the block above. The top block has a muncher to block the player's path. Unfortunately, I couldn't put a sound effect on it as it would be triggered when the block is destroyed by the spike ball. And if the player gets trapped, the potable comes and takes care of their situation. On that note, I'd like to address the people who thought they got softlocked and immediately restarted without waiting for something to kill them to appear. If you don't mind immediately restarting the moment you get trapped, then why are you complaining about the softlock genius? In the next room, once again, the full setup is within plain view. The entire room is based around the spike ball switching the order of items when they are set up this way. I found that kinda hilarious when I first saw it, but when players come here and are in an I want to survive mindset, the switcher is generally lost on them. It's on me, I think the room still works fine as a troll. The one thing you might be wondering about in regards to this room is why on Earth or any other planets is the door a key door? The muncher with the key dying opens the path to the door, so isn't the key way redundant and useless? I'll come back to it later. And then we come to the right side of the map. There's a good reason for why this section is here, and I'll reveal it in a few moments, but let's discuss this room first. Obviously, the troll is that there is a hole under this saw where the mushroom gets trapped, so if the player goes for the greedy choice and gets the boot, the mushroom becomes unavailable. These two blocks are not filled in to create the illusion of a long straight corridor in which the mushroom would just travel back and forth. The reason for the room being made of hard blocks is simply that ground tiles would reveal the hole in the floor. The blue platform is D-cheese. There is no way of preventing the player from bringing the P-switch through to this area, and therefore I had to address the player potentially throwing the switch on the ground to trap the mushroom, go get the boot at their own leisurely convenience, and then get the mushroom too. The blue platform is here to catch the P-switch if anybody throws it. Speaking of which, many players thought that getting the P through the door was cheese and might help them, and kept trying at it even at the cost of many lives, only to find out that it's not possible to bring it through this one block high corridor if they have a mushroom. This hint here helped with resolving that behavior immensely. It's probably the best hint in the level. Also, if Mr. Smartypants has the P activated in this room, this happy little blaster will plop a nice friendly muncher in their way to teach a lesson in ignoring useful hints. And with that we arrive to the big one. Strap in, folks. Starting this moment, the next few seconds of the player's journey are pretty much all about one troll. This one. To make the player collect CP1, walk past it, and get the useless, completely skippable CP2. Since the player has collected the frog suit and died before, the reveal of the CP should hit them like a Megaton surprise hammer. Unfortunately, most people forget about the death by the time this comes, so the troll loses most of its impact. Kinda sad. Anyway, what trickery is there in the Trollmaker's arsenal that would allow the player to collect the CP in one on-off state and just give them a power-up in the other? What juvenile, childish, old cliché can one turn to for such a feat? Well, it's a twice of course. And it all starts with this pipe entry under the helpful suggestion, hold up. The only reason we are on the right side of the map is to show the player that the pipe they are entering is a lonely pipe surrounded by nothing suspicious, right by an unfakeable point of reference, the end card. The position of this area is just a prover to show that they are not being twice. So anybody who cried, twice, in this area, nope, obviously not. Well, not yet. The story I'm telling to the player here is that should they hold up, the switch state remains in the off state and they are forced into the hint pipe. If they go through the thwomp and hit the switch, the state changes and they can go in the red pipe and collect CP2. This story is a lie. There are two doors that lead to the twice section. One above the slowly lowering lava for the player to enter if they ride the very first shell shot by the blaster, and one below that they can enter if enough time passes for the lava to lower and the switch state changes. This is where I have to mention that the choice for the subworld for this level to be a vertical castle is because of this one rule. I needed the lava to hide the door, I needed the area high enough so the lava level would not give the twice away, and I needed the vertical space above it for the shell ride, and it also had the level to only have 2 screens width worth of high lava, because in the other sections it would have just taken up space. Technically I could have done Night Jungle, but the castle works better with the evil theme from an aesthetic standpoint. Let's talk contraptions. For the entry into the top door, what you see is what you get. The blaster fires the shell, it bounces on the spring and deposits the player on the door. No magic. However, there are a few tricksy caveats that I will get into now. The player being shoved into the lava by the spring blaster is very specifically to keep them from just lingering around and seeing the lava reveal the lower door. This is also the reason for the hold up hint. If they enter the door immediately, they see less of the suspicious doorstep. If they choose not to hold up, then they do see the lava lower a bit, and spring or not, the lower door still comes within sight. This is why I have these 1-ups exist. This is kind of a sore spot, but with the position of the 1-ups being what it is, a few pixels of the lower door show either way. A flying 1-up would be positioned perfectly, but then I'd have to explain a pair of wings mysteriously floating behind the blaster on top, and that would be an uncomfortable conversation. The party popper effect on the spot where the player dies is there because it was the best sound effect to help disguise the remaining pixels of the door with the sepia coloration and the particles flying about. Back to the top. The player is free to jump over the shell and wait for a second one. By that time the lava would lower enough to reveal the lower door. Therefore this setup will start an infinite P-switch after the first shell goes by and prevent the player from going down until they hit the switch, uninfiniting the P activations and get a ride down to the lower door. The ride to the lower door requires a few things to happen. First of all, enough time has to pass for the lava to lower. This means that anytime the player is going for the lower door, they have to be given a happy little P wait. It's right before a checkpoint anyway, in fact right before the player getting 2 checkpoints, so don't panic about it. The player activating the P setup from earlier is more of a contingency than the intended path. Hitting the switch, however, will immediately start a P timer regardless of the swamp and the pipe up here. While the P timer is ticking, and the player is grumbling about full P-switch waits and incompetent level creators wasting their time, a very important thing happens. The big bomb here travels down the track, gets lit, and blows up the hard blocks that serve as a ceiling to the top door, unspawn blocking this blaster in the process. Since the switch flips, the top blaster now will be spawn blocked when loading in from the right, and the illusion of just one ceiling with one blaster on top remains intact. Once the player gets riding, the position of the blaster with the spring slightly shifts due to this on-off conveyor, making the player head for the lower door. As they load the area in from the right, the short blaster on the left here is loaded in. Were they headed for the top, the tall blaster would be loaded in and pushed into place by this burner. There's also the issue of the bonk. When going for the lower door, unfortunately no matter what I tried, I couldn't position the player in a way where they wouldn't bonk their head in this hard block here on the way down. They end up where they need to be, but the journey involves cerebral trauma that the other fall didn't. All the annoying, obnoxious sound effects along the path are only there to visually distract the player from the bonk and partially cover it up. Another important aspect of the room is power-up status. I need the player to be big when landing, so these catcher blocks here would stop them right on top of the door. Originally, I gave the player a mushroom before entering the room in every situation, and when they went for the switch, I had a mushroom on a track up here to give it back to them once again. It was functional, but there was an issue, and that brings me to the third and final ride, the one after they do the CP2 section. At that time, the player enters the room in the red state. On that entry, the P is activated immediately, and the player is logged in until the lava lowers. A fine thing in theory, but there's one itty-bitty issue. Were the player to choose not to ride and just drop down, this lower blaster would not be loaded. It was spawn blocked when the player entered, and even though the blocks on top of it are now gone, the area needs to be reloaded from the right for the blaster to appear. If the player was big here, there would be no way of keeping them from just dropping down. So I allowed the player to enter small, and I moved the mushroom to the right. I put it in the top half of the flight for it to be less of a reference point as to what their flight trajectory is. Finally, I added this spike balcony here with this geyser block to make sure the player can't jump off here, since small plus spike equals dead. Let's go through the doors now, shall we? The top door takes the player to the room where the fooling happens. There is no checkpoint here and no path forward, only the hint room. The player is immediately demushroomed, and right after the door is a very simple setup of just 2 blasters and a platform on tracks, nothing fancy. On their first pass they learn about the frog suit behind the wigglers, and that is indeed what is happening in this room. On their second pass they get the frog suit and learn the hint about how to enter this area with the switch in the other state. One important note here is that the wiggler/track setup is way different from the twice room, and therefore the player has to come in way on the left side and approach slowly enough for everything to become identical looking. The room on the right has the portaboo in a claw that removes the ice from the player's path. Thankfully, to the blissful height of the vertical sub-area there is no need to catch the fireball, it despawns in its descent, never to return. And a simple setup with a flying P block and a muncher for the P activation. Below this is the pipe room, with the one pipe leading to the hint room. The player always comes through here in the off state, so they won't have access to the spike or the red pipe. By the way, if you look on the left here, we discover the reason for the shape of the room with the pipe and the door after CP1. The door is just far enough below and on the left so the player can't see it when passing through here. And that's because there is no door here. No need to waste one over a twice. The checkpoint room has a few additional complexities. Obviously it has the checkpoint, but it also has the ELB contraption. It's a very simple one. The shell hits the question mark block, which either releases a spike ball or not, depending on the amount of entities already loaded, or in other words, whether the player happens to be engaged in picking up the red coin at the time or not. If the spike ball spawns, the bomb above is killed, and the hard block harmlessly drops down. If the spike ball poofs out of existence in an unclimactic fashion, the bomb blows up and the switch state changes. The reason this hard block falls on the track below rather than just stay up here hidden is actually quite fascinating. If the player comes in through the left and is taken across the width of this section, a bunch of stuff remains loaded and the winged P-switch will not spawn. By allowing this block to drop down below, it frees exactly one slot for an item to spawn and the player can take the intended path. Another interesting ELB issue was that I had to move this blaster setup around a bit, because in my initial setup, holding left from the CP would have loaded some of it in and the player could have cheesed CP3. I'm just gonna say this. ELB is a nasty finicky bitch and anytime I use it I swear never again to do so. It's just so powerful. On to the CP2 section. When the player enters the room they are presented with a little bit of a fake choice. Get the coin before the checkpoint or the checkpoint before the coin. Naturally it's all kaizoed off, and the effects in the kaizos are for the benefit of the players who see the CP red coin setup and decide to cheese it. At first, the bomb blowing up here might seem like it's there to remove the player's power up when coming through the pipe, but nah. It's just about this muncher's spawn block confinement being broken. The checkpoint gives the player a mushroom anyway. The muncher is there in case the player is blind and fails to see the die on the spike hint and tries to skip CP1 again after the CP2 section. They'd be sent back through the pipe and die on the one way. Once the checkpoint is collected, the player is given a merciful death on this spring here, and CP2 time starts. When the player spawns in without collecting the coin, we have 99 loaded entities and this P-switch spawns and this question block is hit. The P-timer starts, and then the burner pushes this same muncher onto this other P-switch to extend set timer to an appropriate length. Down below, the P activation detonates this bob-omb friend, which removes this block that's a necessary stepping stone to enter the final section of the level. We're just at CP2 here. The next area seems pretty self-explanatory. If the player hits the question mark block quickly before the skewer destroys it, the spike ball thrown by this spike turns around and opens the path. There are two things here that I need to talk about that aren't completely obvious. First of all, whenever you see a skewer in a troll level, it's there to hide something, invariably. This was set up to make it look like the crusher has a troll purpose, when in fact its main duty is to lazily hover over this switch. We'll come back to the switch later. The other thing I'd like to point out here are these two hard blocks on tracks that seemingly do nothing. I'll let you guess. Yup, ELB stuff. If the player goes to the right, loads in a bunch of crap and then hits the question mark block or the kaizo, only nothingness would pop out, Unless I removed a few loaded entities via dropping them off the screen. Did I mention that ELB is Affinity Bitch before? The Muncher throw here is very basic, no need to explain. So is the next room, where all the coins can't drop if they aren't coins but blocks. The hint here goes over most people's heads unfortunately, but who said troll levels need to communicate well? Everybody? Damn. Oh, maybe next level. The saw up top here was added along with the hint. All it does is hide this on off, and it hides it so the player wouldn't mistake it as being part of the deck. It's there for another reason, and we're gonna come back to that. Then we go around and finally get CP1. The first room here is another what you see is what you get type of deal. The last block here has a coin in it that makes it small Zappakupa proof, and if the player decides to dodge upwards, they land in this simple anti. In a previous version the player had to take the Koopa with them, and therefore the path below was kaizoed off so they couldn't come back for it. There was no harm in keeping the kaizoing, so it's still there. Then they come to this next section here, where they might think, this area looks like the same anti-soft lock but on the other side. Except it has a hard block on top, at the height of only 4 blocks. Big brain play. I go in there, the block blows up, I skip whatever decoy section is on my right, I'm smart, SMRT, smart. Then fish, and moving on. The door here is inaccessible. I was left with a door to spare after a major revision, and I figured I might as well use it as lure. Players like going indoors, right? The contraption that removes the block from under it is simply a thwomp with a bomb. If you were to enter the door, you'd end up here, soft-locked. Why didn't I make this not a soft lock, just in case? Because I made that change in mildly mean and forgot about it in evil. Consider it a bit of extra evil, or me being stupid. It's like that, what can I do? As far as I can tell, the door entry here is no longer easily cheesable, like it was when I first set it up. The mushroom that comes down here to save the day is the same one the player encounters later in the CP3 section. Fun things like that can happen when you kill the player before every checkpoint. In this next area, the player is meant to see the blaster, opt for the bomb and trigger one of these on-off switches. The second one is there as anti-cheese, in case the player carefully puts the bomb down a space away from the block. In reality, the P-switch just lets the player through. The next area is also very straightforward. The flying one-up blocks the claw, it allows the player to get the mushroom and progress on. This area doesn't really work like I intended it to. It generally takes about the third time around for the players to realize that they need the 1-up in order to progress. The next roll is also very basic, the paracoin falls, drops the muncher, not much magic there. Now we just need the player to collect the red coin from the twice section, and we are ready to key death them. Here's what the flowchart for the level looked like for the original version. As you can see, there's an arrow from CP1 that leads to CP2. This was a pipe that CP2 the player if entered. It was right here where the door troll is now, and the player got there the exact same way, thinking jumping was the solution. I hated this from the get-go. It was a way to allow the player to go back to CP2 and collect the red coin if they skip that section. After this pipe here, if the player didn't have the key, they would get a hint saying get key and an indicator to take the pipe. A very inelegant solution with several problems. For one, I've had players who repeatedly entered the CP2 pipe thinking they somehow needed to get back there to progress, obviously not great communication in terms of direction. But worse than that, there was, at the time, another reason the player might have entered the pipe without the key, and it's this one. Remember how earlier in the level the player goes through the blaster ride in the twice section? There is a red coin there. In the CP room, it's there for the ELB setup. In the copy room, it's there for twice reasons. Well, obviously I need the player to get that. My original solution to this was to have this red coin here, the bomb up here with the setup. I already thought the player would grant them a lit bomb, if they were big, and then I give them an infinite time in a danger-free zone to check the setup out and have them realize they need to throw the bomb to get the key coin. Once they threw the bomb, it would fall down this shaft and collect the copy room coin for them. I thought the only danger was that they would think something nasty would happen if the bomb blew up down the shaft and would time the throw only to collect the top coin. Boy, was I wrong. I have had people blitzing through this area ignoring the red coin and the bomb alike like they were nothing. A while later I fixed the issue with the voluntary CP2 pipe and the stupid hint, but the problem of multiple reasons for no key through the pipe persisted. Now, the players were facing, at worst, a little bit of confusion about why they were sent on a stupid journey to almost CP2 if they failed to collect the twice coin. Luckily this didn't actually happen with any of the playtesters. But by then I knew I had to find a way to force the player to collect all coins in this area or die. I scrapped the filler troll, replaced a few saws with spikes for parts, and here's the setup that I came up with. The indicator red coin is still there because it doesn't hurt anybody. The bumper blocks the player and draws attention to the coin. The throw indicator clearly screams the solution to the player. For timing purposes, I had no way of controlling when the player would throw the bomb after it was lit if I allowed them to light it at their own pace. I have to force them to light and throw the bomb quickly by having this portal would drop them in the sadness pit if they don't act quickly. And the mechanism that releases the player upward is this clown car setup. With the enemy in the clown car, it will move upwards and stay clear of the node block below. When the bomb is thrown, the plant is killed. The semi-solid prevents the bomb to fall in its place, so it goes on its merry way to collect the coin. The clown car drops on the node block. Launcher hits the P-switch and the player is free. Fun fact, if this P-block was one higher and the player took damage, climbing up here would off-screen the node block just enough for the muncher not to spawn until the player climbed back down. And that's why the P-block is not one higher. After the pipe is the key-no key check. Separating players with or without keys onto different paths without allowing a player with the key to choose is a bit of a hassle, at least in SMB3 and USU. In SMB1 you can do a link setup that works fairly well. In SMW there's a probably cheesable but still mostly consistent up-throw setup, and in 3D World you have low-throw boxes. In SMB3 however, as far as I know, the only way to do this is RNG manipulation. The idea here is that the seed for the RNG is different for the main world and the sub-world, and is affected by whether or not the player is carrying the key. Therefore, if the player enters the main or sub-world for the first time, the only factors that the RNG events will depend on will be the key and what is loaded in the area. We control the latter in the editor and find a situation where the key-no-key status of the player results in what we want. For this particular setup I used the Magikoopa because it's more magical. After everything else in and around this screen was put in place, I got the Magikoopa to turn the ice block on its left into a fish if the player doesn't have the key and a bomb if they do. This was achieved by adding these spawn-logged mushrooms to the area one at a time until a suitable combination of events happened. Fun fact: whether or not the player is carrying the key affects the timing of when the Magikoopa shoots as well as what he spawns. The mushrooms only affect the latter. If the player has no key, it means they have skipped CP2, and as the fish harmlessly flops away, a vine descends, courtesy of this question mark block hit by the spike ball, and they are sent on a path that takes care of that contingency. I'll get back to that later. If they have the key, as they should on the intended path, the switch on the left is flipped by the bomb, and the player is forced into the anti-soft lock on the right. In order for the switch to be loaded, the scroll lock on the left is broken by this bomb. The anti itself is nothing impressive from a contraption standpoint. Then it throws balls, the player jumps, flips switches, and with each flip the Goomba falls. The conveyors are there to keep the player from taking the spring to and leaving it on the other side of the one-ways. The added anti-soft locking challenge is incidental. The point of this anti was to hammer home the point that the meta is way beyond the point of the key death being some sort of surprise or having any sort of wonder left to it. You get the key, you're immediately dying in this horrible anti-room. Deal with it. And for this point to come across clearly, I wanted the player to do the anti with the key floating by their side the whole time, which takes us back to this door. The reason it's a key door is that I needed to make one door, a key door, so the key would stay with the player. Incidentally, the no key check would have also failed if there was no key door in the level anywhere, but that occurred to me way later. After the key death, we land at CP3. The contraption I explained earlier triggers the on-off, and it's pipe time. My expectation was that most players would have a moment of panic immediately quelled by rational thought, and by the time they started walking to the right they would know that they haven't been CP0'd. That was true in some cases, but in many others players seriously entertained the idea that they might have gotten CP0'd. And luckily, maintaining my fragile faith in humanity, nobody actually thought with certainty that this was a CP0. Obviously, if the room is loaded in the blue state, the bombs on the right here are spawn blocked rather than detonated by the blue blocks behind them, and therefore this wall, and more importantly this floor block here, are solid. The player has to go through the blocks on the left. I'm quite proud of how many people this single fish block here got. I wish I could say I used mighty predictive abilities and that block was there and only there forever, but I actually put it there in version 4 or 5 for the final time after seeing what the most frequent jumping spot was. In the pipe we go. The first troll is just a 1000 years old mole with a stag blaster. It activates if the player drops down on the donut, and the block here is just an encouraging yay to lift the spirit of the now trapped Mario. Some people didn't even see that there was a way to walk to the right at all. This is not intentional and only affected a few people. The on-off switch is just bait. If the player jumps for it, they get booed by the level, as per the courtesy of this simple sideways thwomp with a question mark block. The one up here has a coin behind it. The best pixel hunters might spot that there is something there. That's just additional lure for people who are too good at this game. The question mark block is generally shiny enough for most people to miss the mush flying off into the distance here. This next room is kind of a failure. Most people hit the block at the blaster to begin with. Meh, one complete miss is okay in a level this big. The idea here was to make the player think that they need to break through the blocks. The lower one has a boo ring, ha ha ha. The blaster shoots a spike ball which gives the player the bomb, and that's the real way through. The frog suit is just a shiny. These 3 blocks are only there to keep it in place, and the way up is kaizoed. After the bomb goes off, the player lands in the anti that they couldn't get into earlier. The question mark block here is yet another shiny, it has a 1-up in it, but because of the drama effect, many people thought it was a mushroom until they collected it. Not intended, but certainly serendipitous. Once the player enters the door, they are funneled into CP4 through this section here. Now, there are 3 ways to end up here. If the player arrives on the route we just discussed, they come in the red state with no P-switch on. This means that these shellmats, the spike ball here and this blaster are all spawn blocked, but this thwomp isn't, and this bomb goes right. You also can't spawn the spike ball from this question mark block. In the red state, the player jumps down here. The blaster is just there to keep the player from hitting the bomb as it flies through the chute. The bomb opens the wall and the thwomp switches the switch. The player gets the CP but not the coin under it. CP for hype! If the player enters in the blue state, the shellmats are there, the blaster is spawned and the thwomp is spawn blocked. The first shellmat is forced on the player's head, and then they have to switch the switch state using the question mark block, and then they can pick up or kick the second shell. If they pick it up, all they can do is throw it. The shell then hits the on-off switch hidden behind the skewer, and the player is let through. Depending on which way the player came through, 2 things could be the case. If the P-switch is running, then the player came through the feedback loop that takes care of key-deathing the player in case they skip the CP2 section. The red coin is there and the shell collects it. The blaster blocks the player's way and they have earned an anti-free key death. If the player is sent back from the end of the level, they already collected the coin and the P is inactive, therefore they collect the checkpoint and CP2 themselves. And now we finally move on to the CP4 section. It starts with this Rube Goldberg style trap, which goes like this. Hitting the block spawns a big spike ball. That destroys the block, which now allows for the muncher to jump forward from the pipe and push the blaster, blowing up the bomb, switching the switch state, releasing the muncher above. All in about 1.5 seconds. This next section here used to be a janky ass area with a buzzy beetle, donuts, a pit, and it was hard to understand the solution, had some hard cheese and allowed the player to get the beetle through to the next area. It was just bad. I kept patching it, polishing it, trying to fix it, but at the end it was still just a polished turd. The thing I came up with instead was a convoluted nonsense troll, but luckily it got cheesed by Chichiri, and that cheese turned into the actual solution and allowed me to deconvolute the troll, which is now only about the pipe spawning spike balls. If the ball goes to the right, it hits the node block under the bumper, triggers the muncher, and in most cases kills the player. If it goes to the left, the switch state changes and the way is opened up. And whether left or right happens depends on where the player decides to pow away the muncher on the pipe. It's that simple. If the spike ball is allowed to roll to the right, it will activate this muncher, and if the player chose to collect the shiny, the muncher will trap and kill that sucker. The conveyor is anti-cheese, it keeps players from crowd jumping back to the right before the muncher arrives. This fish block here is some legacy anti-cheese from the Beetle version of the level that I left in here because I have no brain and a limited ability to adapt to the changes I make to my own level. The troll with the fire flower is simple enough. If you bump it up, then you end up in the anti. If you jump on the vine, the spike ball in the Kaizo will bump it up for you. Then there is a little truth-telling troll here where I indicate the frog in the question mark block. I just neglect to mention that it will trap the player. Unfortunately, after I raised the ground here, I forgot to check if the player can see the ice coin from that position, and sadly you can, but most people don't notice it anyway. This penultimate troll here is so low concept that when I put the first version together, I didn't even consider why the player would end up in the trap section. I just figured, hey, they go in, they die. A few people still entered. After I had the shiny block above the icicle, this area started to make sense as a troll. The final troll is a simple twister. It's fast, unforgiving, and completely unfair. The twister starts on the very right here and is spawned the moment the player enters this chute. Once on the ground, the player can hesitate a fraction of a second but no more before running for the goal, or they end up top here. They have to hit the P to enter the pipe, and boom, they end up here. While the score lock is broken by this spike ball, they get the star and hit another P. They fall through the wigglers and the checkpoint, collecting the frog suit, which they immediately have to lose. They also at this moment save the red coin from CP2. The infinite P switch keeps running until they go through the pipe and move all the way to the right, pulling the mole off the P switch. Side note, this node block here is just to make it harder for the player to softlock themselves in this P block. With the P switch off, they enter this door and are funneled back to CP2. I have had many players who were super relieved that they got to the CP they started at and thought that they have just experienced some benevolence. And then they respawned and the P went off. And thus, evil was achieved. Thank you for watching this video. I would deeply appreciate if you subscribed to this YouTube channel, and if you're on Twitch, I would be very grateful if you followed my channel there. Thank you.
Oh no!